Before we get into tonight's history, I want to give you one number, 27 million. That is the number of Soviet citizens, soldiers and civilians combined, who died in World War II. Not all casualties, not all countries, just the Soviet Union. 27 million people. To put that in some kind of proportion, the entire population of the state of Texas in 2024 is roughly 32 million. The Soviet Union lost an entire Texas worth of human beings in 6 years. And almost all of it, almost every death on that staggering list, traces back to one decision, made by one man, at 3:15 in the morning on June 22nd, 1941. Tonight, we are going to follow that decision all the way to its end. We are going to move slowly through the whole war, the rise, the early victories, the moments that should have been warning signs, the battles on every ocean and every continent, the cold that stopped armies, the codes that were cracked in secret basements in England, the burning carriers at Midway, the frozen soldiers outside Moscow, and the rubble of Berlin in April 1945. We are going to take our time. There is no rush tonight. But underneath everything, underneath every chapter, every name, every battle, that one decision is waiting. And by the time we reach it, you will understand exactly what it cost. The First World War ended on November 11th, 1918. At exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns went quiet on the Western Front. 4 years of industrial slaughter. 10 million soldiers dead. The map of Europe unrecognizable. And in the rubble, something was planted that would grow for 20 years before it detonated again. The peace treaty signed at Versailles in June of 1919 was not designed to heal. It was designed to punish. Germany was stripped of territory. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. It was forbidden from having tanks, an air force, or submarines. And it was handed a reparations bill, in today's money, something like $500 billion, that it was told to pay to France and Britain. The German people didn't experience this as justice. They experienced it as humiliation. The word they used, diktat, means a dictated peace. Something imposed by force on people who had no real say. And into that wound, a particular kind of politics began to grow. It is important to understand that Adolf Hitler did not seize power in Germany. He was handed it, legally, by people who thought they could control him. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him Chancellor of Germany, after the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. Hindenburg was 85 years old and in failing health. His advisors told him Hitler would be manageable. They were the most catastrophically wrong men in modern history. Within a year, political parties were banned. Unions were dissolved. The press was brought to heel. And Hitler, who had been a failed artist, an Austrian immigrant, and a man who had literally written a book explaining exactly what he intended to do, was now the absolute ruler of 70 million people. The rearmament was the thing that should have broken the peace. Versailles had forbidden Germany from building tanks, from flying military aircraft, from constructing submarines. Hitler violated every one of those terms, openly, starting in 1935 when he unveiled the Luftwaffe, a brand new air force with 2,500 planes, and announced that the German army would be expanded from 100,000 men to 300,000. Britain and France protested, formally, in writing, and did nothing else. That pattern, protest, then nothing, repeated itself every time Germany took the next step. The reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, the absorption of Austria in 1938, the annexation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia also in 1938, after British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and came home waving a piece of paper declaring peace in our time. Each time Hitler moved, he paused, watched the reaction, and found it insufficient. And each time, the lesson he absorbed was the same. The democracies will not fight. They are weak. They are exhausted from the last war. They will give me what I want if I push hard enough. He was not entirely wrong, but he was making an error in his calculations that he would not discover until it was too late. By September 1939, when German tanks crossed into Poland at dawn, the map of Europe had already been redrawn significantly. And Hitler had made 11 major gambles in 6 years, each one rewarded, each one building his contempt for caution, each one making the next bet feel not just safe, but inevitable. The pattern was set. The machine was running. Poland fell in 26 days. This is the statistic most people know. What most people don't feel is the shape of those 26 days, the way they must have felt inside. One day, you are a soldier of a sovereign nation with a real army. A week later, your government is fleeing. 2 weeks after that, you are surrendering to 2 different invaders from the West and the East simultaneously, because the Soviet Union had a secret deal with Germany and invaded from the East on September 17th. The German military operation in Poland was called Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, and the name is both accurate and misleading. It suggests something magical, some revolutionary new technology. The truth is more mundane and more interesting. The Germans had figured out something simple: concentrated armor, tight coordination with aircraft, and most importantly, relentless forward movement. Don't stop at defended positions. Go around them. Cut the communications behind them. Let the enemy collapse from the inside. The Polish army was large. It had cavalry, infantry, artillery, and a proud military tradition. It simply could not process the speed of what was happening to it. After Poland came 6 months of almost nothing, what journalists at the time called the phony war. Both sides dug in along the French border and waited. France had its famous Maginot Line, 100 miles of fortified bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions running along its border with Germany. The French were planning for a war like the last one, static, grinding, decided by depth of fortification. Then on May 10th, 1940, Germany attacked. And it didn't come at the Maginot Line at all. The German plan, proposed by General Erich von Manstein over the objections of his superiors, sent the main armored thrust through the Ardennes forest. That dense, hilly, heavily wooded terrain in southern Belgium and Luxembourg that military planners on both sides had labeled as essentially impassable for tanks. It was passable, barely, slowly, but it was passable, and the Allies had put almost nothing there. The German armor poured through the Ardennes, reached the Meuse River, crossed it under fire, and then turned west, driving a corridor straight toward the English Channel. The effect was to cut off the entire Northern Allied army, British, French, and Belgian, from the rest of France. Within 2 weeks, those forces were backed up against the sea at a small French port called Dunkirk. What happened next should not have been possible. Over 9 days, from May 26th to June 4th, 1940, 338,000 soldiers were evacuated across the English Channel. Not by a coordinated navy, by a navy supplemented by fishing boats, pleasure cruisers, ferries, tugboats, and lifeboats, crewed by civilians. The Little Ships of Dunkirk is a story that sounds like mythology, and it is real. The reason it was possible at all came down to one German order. Hitler halted the panzer advance on May 24th, letting the infantry catch up, giving the encircled army 2 extra days to organize its escape. The exact reasoning behind that halt has been debated by historians for decades. What is undisputed is its effect. It saved the British Army, which would fight again, which would eventually, years later, returned to France in a very different capacity. France signed an armistice on June 22, 1940. 6 weeks after the offensive began, Hitler went to Compiègne, the same forest clearing where Germany had signed its surrender in 1918, and received the French delegation in the same railway car, which he had ordered dragged out of the museum where it was displayed. He was at the peak of his power. He controlled Western Europe from the Atlantic to the Polish border. Britain was isolated. The Soviet Union was, for the moment, his partner. And the lesson he took from it was the same lesson he had taken from every previous success. He was right. His instincts were correct. Anyone who questioned him was weak. That conviction is what made everything that followed possible. Not inevitable, possible. Chosen. Britain should not have been able to fight. Its army had escaped at Dunkirk, but it had abandoned nearly all its heavy equipment on the beaches. It had 25 divisions, mostly armed with rifles, facing a German war machine that had just torn through the most powerful military force in continental Europe in 6 weeks. Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day the German offensive began, and his response to the crisis was extraordinary in its directness. He did not offer comfort. He offered clarity. He told Parliament and then the British people that he had nothing to offer them but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. That there was no good outcome available immediately, only a hard one eventually. Germany's plan to force Britain out of the war was codenamed Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion of the English coast. But Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy, was privately skeptical from the beginning. The Royal Navy still outclassed the Kriegsmarine badly. To even attempt an invasion, the Luftwaffe would first need to establish air superiority over the English Channel and southern England. That effort became the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe had roughly 2,600 aircraft. The Royal Air Force had around 700 fighters. The math seemed straightforward, but two things distorted it. The first was radar. Britain had built a chain of radar stations along its southern and eastern coasts, 21 towers, 300 feet tall, that could detect incoming aircraft at 120 miles. This was not just a detection system. It was connected to a control room at Bentley Priory that could assess the threat and vector fighter squadrons directly toward it. Germany had radar too, but it didn't use it as a coordinated defense system. Britain did. The second thing was simpler. The Luftwaffe was being asked to destroy something that kept rebuilding itself. Every RAF pilot who bailed out over English soil climbed back into a plane the next morning. German pilots who survived were prisoners. The British were fighting a war they could not afford to lose over their own homeland. The psychological differential was significant. Crucially, the Luftwaffe's commander, Hermann Göring, made a strategic error in early September 1940 that historians mark as decisive. The RAF's airfields were under severe pressure, squadrons were stretched, pilot losses were mounting. And then, after a stray German bomb hit London accidentally, and the RAF retaliated with a raid on Berlin, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to switch from attacking airfields to attacking London. The Blitz on London began on September 7, 1940. It was brutal. More than 50,000 British civilians would die in the bombing campaign that followed. But it gave the RAF's airfields 2 weeks to recover. And by the time the Germans resumed serious attacks on military infrastructure, the window for invasion had passed. On September 17, 1940, Hitler quietly postponed Operation Sea Lion. It was never rescheduled. Britain had survived. The war would continue. While Europe was burning, the Pacific was tipping. Japan had been at war with China since 1937. By 1940, it was eyeing the European colonies in Southeast Asia, French Indochina, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil, rubber, and strategic minerals. The United States responded to Japanese expansion with sanctions, then broader trade restrictions, then in the summer of 1941, a freeze on Japanese assets and an embargo on oil. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil. The embargo was an existential threat. The Japanese military calculated they had roughly 18 months of fuel reserves. After that, without access to the oil fields of Southeast Asia, their war machine would grind to a halt. So they made a decision. If war with the United States was coming anyway, better to strike first, and strike hard enough to buy time to consolidate before American industrial power could mobilize. The target was Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack on December 7, 1941, was a tactical masterpiece and a strategic catastrophe. In less than 2 hours, Japanese aircraft sank or damaged 8 American battleships, killed 2,400 Americans, and destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground. The harbor burned. But the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were not in port that day. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had designed the operation, understood what that meant. He had spent time in the United States before the war. He knew American industrial capacity. He reportedly said, after hearing the news of the attack, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Whether those exact words were his or not, the sentiment was real. He had written similar things in private correspondence. The United States declared war on Japan the next day, and Hitler, without consulting anyone, apparently acting on instinct and ideology, declared war on the United States 4 days later. He was not required to by the terms of his alliance with Japan. He chose to. It was, by most historical assessments, one of the single most self-destructive decisions of the entire war. America was now in on both sides of the globe. 6 months later, in June 1942, the Pacific War reached its pivot at a small atoll called Midway. Yamamoto's plan for Midway was elaborate. The idea was to lure the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle, destroy them, and then establish a defensive perimeter so broad that the United States would be forced into negotiations before its industrial machine could fully mobilize. American codebreakers had read enough of Japan's encrypted communications to know the broad outline of the plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his 3 remaining carriers in an ambush position northeast of Midway. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the Japanese strike force launched its first wave against Midway Island. After the raid, the Japanese commander Admiral Nagumo faced a decision that would haunt naval history forever. He had kept half his aircraft in reserve, loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed to attack ships, just in case American carriers showed up. But Midway's defenses were not fully destroyed. It needed another strike. So Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft to be rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on the island. And then a scout plane reported American ships to the northeast, including, it seemed, a carrier. Nagumo ordered the rearming stopped and reversed. Strip the land attack bombs back off. Reload with ship attack weapons. This takes time. It is not a 5-minute job. The carrier decks were covered in bombs being moved, fuel lines being connected and disconnected, aircraft being repositioned. The hangar decks below were packed with ordnance that had not yet been properly stowed. The window was somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes. American dive bombers arrived from above. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were on fire. Hiryu survived and launched a counterattack that badly damaged the American carrier Yorktown. But that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and left it burning too. All 4 of Japan's fleet carriers sunk in a single day, along with their aircraft. along with hundreds of their most experienced naval pilots. Japan never fully recovered from Midway. The carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was gone. The war in the Pacific would continue for 3 more years, but its outcome was functionally decided on June 4, 1942, in the 30 minutes it took to rearm aircraft that never got to fly. Now we come to the decision. Let us set the scene properly. By June 1941, Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Its U-boats were strangling British supply lines in the Atlantic. Its air force had failed to bring Britain to its knees, but Britain was isolated and struggling. The Soviet Union was Germany's nominal partner under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, and Hitler had been planning to betray that partnership since the moment he signed it. Ideologically, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not an impulse. Hitler had written about it in Mein Kampf in 1925. He called the vast territories to the East Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. The Slavic populations living there were, in his framework, racially inferior, suitable for subjugation or elimination. The conquest of the Soviet Union was not a war aim. It was the war aim. Everything else had been preparation. His generals were less certain. Franz Halder, the chief of the Army General Staff, kept a meticulous diary during the planning phase. His entries in the spring of 1941 contain a remarkable tension. The professionalism of a military planner doing his job, crossed with something that reads, in retrospect, like suppressed dread. The distances were immense. Soviet industrial capacity was unknown, but probably larger than German intelligence estimated. The Red Army had been weakened by Stalin's purges. 3/4 of its senior officers had been shot or imprisoned in the late 1930s, but it had recovered somewhat, and the Soviet Union was vast in a way that maps could not quite convey. Hitler dismissed these concerns. He told his generals, "We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will collapse." At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the German artillery opened fire along a front that stretched more than 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by 600,000 troops from Romania, Hungary, Italy, Finland, and Slovakia, crossed the Soviet border simultaneously. It was the largest military operation in history. The initial results were staggering. In the first 2 weeks, Soviet forces suffered catastrophic losses. Entire armies were encircled and captured. The Luftwaffe destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft, many of them on the ground before they could take off. German armored spearheads drove 200, 300, 400 miles into Soviet territory. At Minsk, a double envelopment captured more than 300,000 prisoners. At Smolensk, another 310,000. From the outside, it looked like France all over again, faster even. But there were warning signs, small ones, that the men at the sharp end could feel even if the high command could not. The roads were different. French roads were paved. Soviet roads were often dirt tracks that dissolved into mud when it rained. Vehicles broke down. Supply columns fell behind. The deeper the panzers pushed, the longer the gap between the armored spearhead and the infantry walking behind it. The enemy was different. French soldiers, surrounded and cut off, tended to surrender. Soviet soldiers, surrounded and cut off, often kept fighting. A pocket that should have been eliminated in 3 days sometimes took 3 weeks, and the pockets were enormous, hundreds of thousands of men refusing to simply stop. And the country was different. You could drive 400 miles into France and be at the Channel. You could drive 400 miles into the Soviet Union and still have 1,200 miles to go to reach the Ural Mountains. By late July 1941, the panzers of Army Group Center had advanced almost to Smolensk, and were less than 400 kilometers from Moscow. Heinz Guderian, the general who had driven the Ardennes breakthrough in France, the architect of modern armored warfare, believed the way to Moscow was open. His tanks were moving. The Soviet defenses ahead were disorganized. He pressed for permission to continue northeast. Hitler stopped him. Ukraine, to the south, had not been fully secured. Hitler wanted the industrial regions, the coal, the wheat, the economic foundation of the Soviet state. He ordered Guderian's Army Group Center panzers to turn south and drive toward Kiev. Guderian protested. Halder protested. Even Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief, raised objections. Hitler overruled them all. The Kiev operation was a tactical masterpiece. The resulting encirclement captured 665,000 Soviet soldiers, the largest single military encirclement in history. It was announced in Germany as proof of Hitler's genius. It cost 6 weeks. By the time the Kiev pocket was eliminated and the panzers turned back north toward Moscow, it was mid-September. The German plan for the campaign, Operation Barbarossa, had assumed Moscow would fall by early October at the latest, before the Russian winter set in. Operation Typhoon, the offensive toward Moscow, began on September 30th, 1941. The initial progress was encouraging. 2 more Soviet armies were encircled at Vyazma and Bryansk. The road to Moscow seemed clear. Then, in the first week of October, it rained. Not a drizzle. Weeks of heavy, sustained autumn rain that turned Soviet roads, already marginal, into seas of mud. The German military had a name for it, Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads. It stopped tanks. It swallowed trucks. Supply lines that had been fragile became impossible. An army that had been moving 40 miles a day began moving 4. By late October, Army Group Center was still 60 miles from Moscow, and the temperature was beginning to drop. Hitler had not issued winter clothing to his soldiers, not through malice, through calculation. He had expected the campaign to be over before winter. The clothing was ready in warehouses in Poland. It simply had not been sent forward, because sending it forward would have been an admission that the campaign was running long. German soldiers spent November in the Soviet mud, and then the Soviet frost wearing summer uniforms. The temperature fell to -20, then -30, then -40 Celsius. Tank engines seized. Gun mechanisms froze. Men lost fingers to frostbite. By December 4th, 1941, the leading German reconnaissance units were 40 kilometers from Red Square. In clear weather, you could see the spires of Moscow from hilltops. On December 5th, 1941, Soviet forces launched a massive counteroffensive. Stalin had kept reserve divisions hidden, formations transferred from Siberia, where they had been watching for a Japanese attack on the Soviet Far East. A Soviet spy network in Japan had passed intelligence suggesting the Japanese were planning to move south, not west, toward the Pacific, toward Pearl Harbor. That intelligence freed up Soviet Siberian divisions. These soldiers were equipped for winter. They were trained for it. They attacked in conditions that made German movement almost impossible. For the first time since 1939, a German army fell back. Hitler's response was to fire Field Marshal von Brauchitsch and assume personal command of the army himself. He relieved Guderian. He relieved dozens of other generals who had dared suggest withdrawal. He issued an order that there would be no more retreats. The line would hold. Every position would be defended to the last man. The line did eventually hold, but the dream of a quick victory in the East was dead. Hitler had 6 weeks in August and September of 1941 when Moscow was within reach. He spent them taking Kiev. By the time he turned back to Moscow, the window had closed. That is the decision. That is the 3:15 in the morning. Not just the launch of Barbarossa itself. That was the strategic bet. The fatal decision inside the fatal decision was the 6 weeks in Ukraine, the delay that handed the Soviet winter to the defenders. The war in the East continued into 1942, but it was a different war now. Germany could no longer aim for total conquest. It aimed instead for resources, the oil fields of the Caucasus, without which its tanks would eventually run dry. The summer offensive of 1942 was called Case Blue. The plan split the Southern Army Group. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus. Army Group B would advance east, capturing a city on the Volga River as it went, a city named by one of history's darkest coincidences, Stalingrad. By August 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus was fighting its way into the city. What followed was unlike any previous battle of the war. The rubble of Stalingrad's bombed buildings became a defensive maze. Street by street, building by building, sometimes room by room, both sides fed men into the destruction. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov developed a tactic he called hugging the Germans, keeping his frontline troops so close to the German lines that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb them without hitting their own men. The Volga River, just east of the city, was the lifeline. Every night, Soviet reinforcements crossed under German fire in flat-bottomed boats. Every night, German artillery tried to close the river. And every night, the boats got through. Some of them, most nights. The fighting was so dense, so specific, that certain buildings had names. The grain elevator, the Red October factory, the barricades factory, Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building held by a Soviet sergeant named Yakov Pavlov and his small unit for 58 days against constant German attacks. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces attacked the German flanks. Not the Sixth Army in Stalingrad, but the Romanian and Italian armies holding the wings north and south of it. These forces were less well-equipped, less well-supplied, and occupying thinly held lines on frozen steppe. They broke in hours. The Soviet pincers met west of Stalingrad on November 23rd. The German Sixth Army, 330,000 men, was surrounded. Paulus asked for permission to break out. Hitler refused breakout permission. He declared Stalingrad a fortress. He declared it would be relieved. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a relief operation in December 1942, Operation Winter Storm. His panzers drove to within 48 kilometers of the encirclement before Soviet resistance stopped them. He urged Paulus to break toward him. Paulus would not move without Hitler's order. The order never came. By January 1943, the pocket was shrinking. Men were dying of cold, starvation, and wounds that could not be treated. On January 31, 1943, Paulus, who had been promoted to field marshal by Hitler the day before, in the apparent belief that no German field marshal would surrender, surrendered. He was the first German field marshal ever to be captured alive. Of the 330,000 men encircled at Stalingrad, about 91,000 surrendered. Of those, roughly 5,000 would eventually return to Germany. The rest died in captivity. In July 1943, Germany attempted one more major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Soviet lines had pushed a large bulge into German-held territory around the city of Kursk, a salient 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep, held by Soviet armies. German planners saw an opportunity to cut it off, encircle the forces inside, and recover the initiative. The operation was called Citadel. Hitler delayed it repeatedly, waiting for enough of the new Tiger and Panther tanks to be available. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to prepare. Soviet intelligence knew the attack was coming, not approximately, precisely. They spent the delay building defensive belts, anti-tank ditches, minefields, artillery positions, Hundreds of miles of defenses, in depth, layered, planned specifically to absorb the German armored thrust and bleed it dry before the Soviet counterattack. Kursk became the largest tank battle in history. Perhaps 6,000 tanks engaged over a 10-day period. Germany advanced, on its southern face, about 20 miles, at staggering cost. And then the Soviet counterattack came, and the gains evaporated, and the Germans fell back, and they never stopped falling back in the east for the rest of the war. In the Atlantic, meanwhile, a parallel war had been unfolding since 1939. Germany's submarine fleet, U-boats, had nearly won it. At their peak in 1942, they were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. What closed it was technology. Allied code breaking, the Enigma cracking operation at Bletchley Park that had been reading German naval messages since 1941, allowed convoy routes to be diverted around U-boat positions. New radar technology detected submarines on the surface, and the mass deployment of escort carriers closed the mid-Atlantic gap where convoys had been most vulnerable. In May 1943, Admiral Donitz lost 41 U-boats in a single month. He withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. He called it, in his diary, a disaster. The Atlantic was never closed. The supplies kept flowing. The American industrial machine kept delivering. While the East was being decided in blood and mud, the Western Allies were fighting their way up from the South. North Africa fell to the Allies in May 1943. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. Then Sicily. Then the Italian mainland. Mussolini was overthrown by his own government. Italy's surrender in September 1943 opened a new front that Hitler now had to defend with forces he could not spare from the east. The Italian campaign was brutal, slow, and expensive. The terrain, mountains, rivers, narrow valleys, favored the defender perfectly, but it kept 24 German divisions tied up south of the Alps, away from France, away from the east, where they might have mattered. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history came ashore on 5 beaches in Normandy, France. The planning had taken 2 years. The deception, Operation Fortitude, a massive intelligence campaign designed to convince Germany that the real invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy, may have been as important as the landing itself. German reserves were held back for weeks after D-Day, waiting for an attack at Calais that never came. The cost on June 6th was enormous. At Omaha Beach, American forces came ashore in the face of direct machine gun fire, artillery, and mines, in rough seas that sank many of the supporting tanks before they reached the shore. More than 2,000 Americans died on Omaha alone that day, but they stayed. They climbed. They moved off the beach. By nightfall, the Allies had a foothold. By August, Paris was liberated. By December, Germany had launched its last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, and failed. By March 1945, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. From the east, Soviet armies had been pushing since the summer of 1944 with relentless, overwhelming force. Operation Bagration in June 1944 destroyed Army Group Center, an entire German army group, roughly 300,000 men, in 4 weeks. Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. Hitler's last weeks were spent in the Führer bunker, 16 feet below the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin. By late April, Soviet troops were fighting street by street through the city above him. The sound of artillery was constant. He was 56 years old. He had started the war 6 years earlier with what he genuinely believed was an invincible strategic vision. He had overruled his generals so many times that the ablest ones had stopped trying to argue with him. He had fired or dismissed every senior officer who told him something he didn't want to hear. On April 30th, 1945, he died by suicide. Soviet soldiers reached the chancellery the next day. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was given a choice: trial before the People's Court, with his family subject to reprisal, or suicide with a state funeral and his family's safety guaranteed. He chose suicide on October 14, 1944. He was 52 years old. Friedrich Paulus spent the rest of the war as a Soviet prisoner and later broadcast anti-Nazi propaganda from captivity. He was released in 1953 and died in Dresden in 1957. Heinz Guderian, the tank general who had argued for the push on Moscow that Hitler denied, survived the war and spent his retirement writing memoirs defending his own decisions and blaming Hitler for the rest. Hermann Göring was captured, tried at Nuremberg, sentenced to death, and died of a cyanide capsule the night before his scheduled execution. In the Pacific, the war continued until August 1945. American forces had moved steadily west across the Pacific since Guadalcanal, island by island, each one costlier than the last. Iwo Jima, in February 1945, took 36 days and killed 6,800 Americans. Okinawa, from April to June 1945, killed 12,000. Military planners projecting casualties for a land invasion of the Japanese home islands were estimating numbers in the hundreds of thousands, possibly a million, on both sides. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The combined immediate death toll exceeded 100,000 people. The destruction of 2 cities in 3 days by weapons that could be carried in a single aircraft had no precedent in human experience. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender was signed on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. World War II was over. The human cost of World War II is a number that resists comprehension. Most historians put the total death toll at somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. Roughly 40 million of those were civilians. The Soviet Union, 27 million. China, 15 to 20 million. Germany, 6 to 9 million, soldiers and civilians. Poland, 6 million, roughly 17% of its entire pre-war population. Japan, 3 million. Yugoslavia, 1 million. France, 560,000. Britain, 450,000. The United States, 420,000. Every one of those numbers is made of people. Letters that were never answered. Photographs on mantelpieces. Names carved into memorials in languages you may not speak but can still read. At the beginning of tonight's history, I told you that almost all of those 27 million Soviet deaths trace back to one decision made by one man at 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941. Here is what historians broadly agree on. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a decision Hitler made by ideology, not strategy. He had always intended to do it. But the window for success, if there was one, was narrow. The German military's own internal assessments before the campaign suggested that a quick victory was only possible if the campaign concluded before the Russian winter. Every week of delay mattered. The diversion to Kiev in August 1941 cost Germany 6 weeks it could not replace. Those 6 weeks pushed the Moscow offensive into October, into mud, into the Rasputitsa. The mud pushed it into November, into the first frosts. The frosts pushed it into December, into temperatures of -40, into mechanical failure and frostbite, and soldiers dying of exposure in summer boots. 40 kilometers from Moscow. 40 kilometers. If the German advance had reached Moscow in October, not necessarily captured it, but reached it, cut its rail lines, put it under siege, Soviet command and control would have collapsed. The government would have evacuated. The symbolic effect would have been enormous. Instead, the window closed. The Siberian divisions arrived. The counter-offensive began. And from that point forward, Germany was fighting the war that it could not win. Everything that followed, Stalingrad, Kursk, the slow retreat, Berlin, follows from those 6 weeks in August and September 1941. The 6 weeks Hitler spent being right about Ukraine instead of listening to the generals who were right about Moscow. World War II was not lost at Stalingrad. It was lost at Smolensk in the summer of 1941, when Guderian's panzers turned south on Hitler's order instead of north toward the city that mattered. The world that came out of World War II was different from the world that went into it. New international institutions were built, the United Nations, the World Bank, NATO, designed to make another war of this scale impossible by making the costs of aggression collective rather than individual. Germany was divided, rebuilt, eventually reunified. Japan was demilitarized, rebuilt, transformed into one of the most prosperous economies on Earth. The British Empire began its long dissolution. The American economy became the engine of global recovery. The Soviet Union emerged from the war with 27 million dead and the strongest conventional army on Earth. The Cold War that followed was, in many ways, the unfinished argument of 1941, still unresolved, still asymmetric, still running on the trauma of what it cost to survive. And the weapons that ended the Pacific War, those 2 bombs, dropped in August 1945, introduced something that had not existed in human history before, the possibility of total annihilation, not the destruction of an army or a city or a country, the destruction of everything. That possibility has not gone away. The soldiers who fought in World War II are almost all gone now. The last veterans of the Pacific are in their late 90s. The last survivors of Auschwitz are recording their testimonies with the urgency of people who know the window is closing. What they leave behind is not just history, it is evidence. Evidence of what happens when democracies decide, for long enough, that someone else's catastrophe is not their problem. Evidence of what happens when one person's unchallenged certainty meets no meaningful resistance for long enough to feel like destiny. Evidence that things which feel inevitable were, in fact, chosen. Before you go, give me one word from tonight's history. Just one word. I'll be reading. And if you want to go back further, to the trenches and the mud and the artillery of the war that made all of this possible, that's coming next.